Well, it's my pleasure to introduce Heidi Hauserman, who will come up to the stage. Heidi is in our Department of Human Ecology. She, too, as I introduced earlier, is on the planning committee. I was going through Heidi's publications and realized that if I could choose a dissertation, I might choose one like hers. And the title of it, or at least one of her publications, was Maintaining the Coffee Canopy, Understanding Change and Continuity in Central Veracruz. I live off of coffee from morning till about 3 or 4 in the afternoon, and I wish I could study something that I enjoyed so much. Heidi, come on up. A new light corner. No, but tell Petra, and then that's fresh water.
Okay, great, thanks. All right, so it's a pleasure to introduce our afternoon keynote speaker, Dr. Petra Chakart. Petra finished her PhD at the University of Arizona the semester before I started graduate school there. And when I arrived in Tucson, I heard a lot about her charisma, her really exciting research, and her impressive dancing skills. But I didn't have the opportunity to meet her until I moved to State College in 2010 to work with her as a postdoc. Petra, of course, has an impressive academic record and is well known for her work on climate change vulnerability and adaptation among marginalized populations in sub-Saharan Africa. She's an associate professor in the Department of Geography at the Pennsylvania State University and holds a senior research fellow position at the Center for International Climate and Environmental Research in Oslo. Her research has been funded by various agencies and institutions, including USAID, NIH, and the Research Council of Norway. She has also received multiple NSF awards, including those from the Offices of International Science and Engineering, Human and Social Dynamics, and Coupled Natural and Human Systems. And all of this well-funded research has, of course, resulted in prolific academic publication in various venues, including journals such as Environment and Planning A, Climate and Development, Antipode, Global Environmental Change, Climatic Change, and Climate Policy. And I think the wide thematic range of journals and edited volumes that Petra has published in really speaks to her commitment to interdisciplinary research and the wide-reaching implications of her work. Indeed, her research is almost always centered around interdisciplinary collaboration, and she's one of the only people I know who could get a mineral engineer, medical doctor, chemist, geographer, and rural Pennsylvania public school teacher into a Land Rover together. In the last 2 years, Petra has played a key role as coordinating lead author for Chapter 13 and Working Group 2 of the IPCC's assessment report, and I suspect we'll hear a great deal about this exciting work today. And to close, I can finally attest from personal observation that Petra indeed possesses the amazing ability to dance to any tune, anywhere, at any time. So please join me in welcoming Dr. Petra Chakart.
Well, good afternoon, everybody. I only dance, of course, if I have an audience, so it's all in your hands. The topic for this afternoon is vulnerability in the tropics. And I would like to get that started with a reflection from you guys here in the audience. What is it you suspect from everything you have heard this morning and from the posters you have seen over lunch in terms of vulnerability in the tropics? Are you expecting vulnerability in the tropics to be high or to be low? And I would like to see hands. So how many of you think vulnerability to climate change in the tropics is high? Raise your hands. How many of you think, and maybe there's 1 or 2 or 3, that vulnerability will be low? That is fascinating. Let's be aware, this is a topic discussed in geography. Some of that understanding or perception that vulnerability in the tropics is high is, of course, related to colonial fears about the tropic and the perception that the tropics are poverty-stricken, disease-ridden, and disaster-prone, And we shall see if this perception comes true or not. I will talk about some of the insights from the IPCC, but I would like to preface this by saying whether or not vulnerability in the tropics is high or low depends to a great deal on how we understand vulnerability. For those of you who have followed the IPCC for a couple of years, at least since the fourth assessment report, you will know one definition of vulnerability that is indeed quite well known. Vulnerability being the function of exposure to a climate hazard, sensitivity, and adaptive capacity. And that is a definition that shows up in the AR4, the fourth assessment report that came out in 2007, and that reflects literature since 2000, 2001. And indeed, during that time, the understanding that vulnerability is a function of a climate hazard driven by exposure, sensitivity to that hazard, and adaptive capacity to that hazard dominated the field. This was the understanding. So be aware here, vulnerability is framed directly with respect to the climate hazard, to the size, the magnitude, the time, and persistence of that climate impact. This understanding triggered, and I will show you a couple of those, an abundance of vulnerability maps, because this type of vulnerability can be mapped easily, especially when we talk about global maps, because it's directly related to a climate impact, sea level rise or temperature extremes. Now, we have moved away from the definition of vulnerability. Since 2011, in the special report of the IPCC called SREX, as well as in the IPCC report that came out this year, vulnerability is decoupled from the climate hazard. We understand now vulnerability as the propensity or predisposition to be adversely affected or experience harm, independent of a climate stressor. So we understand vulnerability now as being intrinsic, built, baked into every society, independent of where we are on the globe. Of course, this vulnerability then intersects with climate stressors to create risks, but I'm going to get there. This type of vulnerability, or this understanding of vulnerability, is much more rooted in an understanding of uneven development processes and inequalities in societies. And you will see this definition of vulnerability doesn't lend itself to all these vulnerability maps. It's much more important to have good case studies, to have a good conceptual understanding, and I would like to lead you through this kind of evolution of the understanding of vulnerability, and we can come back afterwards to see if all your hands you raised for vulnerability in the tropics being high is in fact the case or not. One of the great examples, of course, are the two images here, heat stress or water scarcity in the Sahel. We have known that for quite some time. We know the Sahel as an area that is affected by drought as part of the normal climate pattern or variability. But if you think about the heat wave in 2003 in Europe, who were the people who were impacted? Who were the vulnerable people in Europe? Europe is not in the tropics, right? Who were the vulnerable? Any guesses? Age, the elderly, the socially isolated, right? Because they are the proof, the living proof of inequality in the societies that we have in Europe. Same is true for the Chicago heat wave, right? It was based on race, social isolation, and age. So we're going to explore that a little bit here together. Now, this proliferation of maps that show vulnerability or hotspots of vulnerability. There's a wonderful summary article by Alex Sherbinin, just came out this year, that talks about these vulnerability maps, or the vulnerability hotspot maps that were based on similar experiences that people made with biodiversity hotspot maps earlier in the 1990s. And so these maps all focus on a particular aspect of climate vulnerability. It could be food security, it could be stress on the water system, it could be conflicts, and of course people who are familiar with GIS and remote sensing, they were particularly involved in that because it's mappable, right? You can put a specific location to it. Now, at the same time as the AR4 came out, there was more and more emphasis on vulnerability that is not directly linked to a climate stressor. And Karen O'Brien called that very, very eloquently already 7 years ago, contextual vulnerability, context-specific vulnerability, rather than outcome or exposure vulnerability. But as we shall see, this contextual or intrinsic vulnerability is really difficult to map because very often we need proxies. And we have just chatted about this earlier. How do we map adaptive capacity? Well, sometimes we take education for adaptive capacity, but it's a proxy. Is it a good proxy? Well, often not. And we have difficulty mapping issues like marginalization that is not really tied to a geographic location. So we know there are problems with these maps, and with colleagues at the Climate Center in Oslo, Cicero, we have reflected on that as well and found specific blind spots in these vulnerability maps, especially the hotspot maps. And they have to do with two primary facts here. One is that vulnerability, of course, is dynamic, right? It is not just static as we like to capture it in maps and in indices. And it really often results in overconfidence in the context of these maps that then lead to decision-making processes, especially among policymakers, that are premature and actually not at all based on ethical and actable facts. And there's also an overemphasis on what we call inherent vulnerability. So if we mapped you in this room and said, this part here is vulnerable, it seems like it's your particular fault that you are vulnerable, rather than understanding the really complicated institutional and social and political drivers that make you, this 2/3 of the room here, vulnerable, right? So we overlook that because we can't map it. And that also leads to it deflects attention from something we call relational vulnerability, and I will get to that at the very end. Okay, so do keep in mind we have these maps and we have hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of them, and I will show you just a couple, but we know they're problematic. And what I would like to do with you here during my 40 minutes is to understand how we can do better, right? That's the purpose. So, of course, we know where the tropics are. This is one map that is in the AR5 that shows regions, and you can see the colors here, that exhibit relatively high projected temperature changes compared to the mean, often more than 50%. And already you can see this is not in the tropics, right? So that's a different map than the one you saw this morning, but it's an equally valid map. So we're going to focus on this area here that we call the tropics. This first map I'm going to show, and you can see that right away, doesn't really have anything to do with vulnerability, but it's often used as an input to vulnerability maps. And what it does, it shows the difference between more and more frequent or extreme events, hot days, very hot days, very dry days, and sequences of very warm, very dry, very wet, compared to internal vulnerability. And so the areas you can see here in dark red are the areas where the difference really matters between extreme events and natural variability. And here we do see the tropics showing up as dark red. But we also see higher latitudes showing up as difference, right? Again, this is not a vulnerability map, but it shows where we can kind of start to debate whether or not, in the old definition, there is an exposure factor. It's a different map. It shows Climate Demography Vulnerability Index, CDVI. So here we have exposure again to what we saw on the previous map, but also population density and rapid population growth, knowing that vulnerability must have to do something with the people who live there. And you can see the tropics showing up here as high. So that's comforting, at least for you who raised your hands. So maybe there is a link between the tropics and vulnerability. A different map, focusing on humanitarian crisis. That's a map that was based on the World Bank hazards like cyclones and flooding and drought, and overlaid, no interaction implied here, just overlaid with different types of human, financial, economic, and natural vulnerability. And what we see here is already a different picture, right? Blue, highly vulnerable. Actually, most of Africa, Certainly countries in the Sahel or just to the north of it in the Saharan Desert, but also most of Asia that is outside of the tropics. So here, I wouldn't say the tropics are particularly vulnerable. Another one here, and that's a more sophisticated approach. It came out not too long ago, 2011, and that particular approach looks at climate vulnerability in the context of food security in the tropics, so a specific emphasis on the tropics. And so what the authors did here, Polly Erickson, a colleague of mine, was the lead. They took a number of threshold maps, I think a dozen or so, and I showed 2 here, and overlaid these climate threshold maps with sensitivity and coping maps to generate a picture for the tropics. So I have 2 examples here. One is temperature maximum flip around 30 degrees. Will the temperature flip? And the length of the growing season decreasing by more than 5%. And you can see the speckles kind of all over the tropics and slightly outside of the tropics, overlaid by, as I said, sensitivity. Here we have it for different crops on the upper map. And I am also shocked, like many of you, how the colors come out very differently here. That is fascinating. Makes no difference here for this one. The lower one is coping capacity. And again, we're taking a proxy here. So in this case, stunting is taken as a proxy for coping capacity. We can debate whether stunting is a good proxy, right? Does stunting really tell us something about the ability of people to cope? Well, it was taken as an indicator, and as I said, these various components were overlaid to create domains of vulnerability, and we have exposure, we have sensitivity, we have coping capacity or adaptive capacity, just like they were defined in the IPCC Area 4, and then we have high and low and various combinations of those. And we want to test where vulnerability to food insecurity is highest. I give you 5 seconds to interpret this map. Pick the upper one, pick the lower one, whatever you want. Where are the areas of highest vulnerability? India and Africa. And that's maybe not even true, because India here as blue shows up as low exposure with low capacity. It's a map that is difficult to read. That's the point here, right? It's very sophisticated, it has various layers, but it's not so easy to read now and understand, identify very quickly where the areas are of highest vulnerability. And fair enough, these colors are not quite what I have here, but it makes no difference, right? It's not easy to spot these areas. Another map here looks at vulnerability profiles. And again, the colors may or may not be meaningful, but what you see right away is that we have barely anything in the tropics, because this particular vulnerability profile was directed towards dryland smallholder farming systems. And they're just at the edge of the tropics. So maybe it doesn't help us a whole lot here. I'm going to show you a last one, which is global. Security hotspots. Now, think with me here critically. And I know conflict came up earlier, and now we just phrase it as security. It doesn't matter. Does this map help us to understand where we can expect security hotspots? Where are the critical geographers here? This is a broad generalization, right? So we look at conflict constellations based on impacts on food production, impacts on storms and floods, on freshwater resources and migration. Conflicts often emerge not because of an environmental trigger, but because of weak institutions, of weak governance structures. So don't be fooled by maps like this. It may generate a debate, but it certainly does not tell us in any way that conflicts in the tropics are to be expected with climate change. Right? We can't say that. We get to conflict a little later again. We, of course, can focus on continents or regions. Here's one example of a map that looks at composite vulnerability in Africa. And highest is the red here. You know, there's some in the tropics. The DRC comes to mind here, but then we have the Horn of Africa. We have all of the Sahel here. So again, you know, we can't say that in the tropics in Africa, vulnerability is highest. Various parameters that go in there. A regional hotspot map for Southern Africa. And for those of you who are kind of catching on to this critical perspectives on mapping vulnerability, you will clearly see here right away that vulnerability follows state borders. And can we really say that, you know, the vulnerability in this area between Zimbabwe and Botswana and South Africa, is there really such a clear divide? Can we say that? Well, you know, maybe it does have to do with the governments that, or the people who are in charge of governments there. But vulnerability is more complex than you can see it here. And my last one here, and I'm going to be super critical, this is one I've seen students of mine who work in Asia, Southeast Asia, use, and I find it highly, highly problematic. Regional vulnerability for Southeast Asia. Again, you can see the colors clearly. Red is the highest climate change vulnerability. But what goes in there is not even climate change. It's climate hazards, cyclones, droughts, floods, landslides, and coastal inundation that may or may not be caused by climate change, population density, and adaptive capability, and all those are averaged. We don't even look at the interaction between them to produce a map like this. I would not want to be a policymaker who has to make a decision whether or not to fund an adaptation project here or here. Don't be fooled by these maps. I want to show one which comes from the US, and it's fairly recent, 2013. I know this is outside of the tropics, but it does take a more critical approach to getting at these underlying drivers of vulnerability that are caused by inequality. That's one for the northeastern US, and it relates to sea level rise, and you can say that, we'll see what colors we have. We have the purple, which is good, high vulnerability, and you see it's really speckled. What are the parameters that go into it? Well, it's these ones here, and we have more than just population density. We have poverty in there, we have rural urban, we have age, which we pointed out is an important factor in heat waves, foreign-born, occupation, and gender. So maybe we're on the right track here. So maybe that is a better approach to map, to visualize vulnerability than what we have seen so far. Okay, so I think you feel my level of discomfort with vulnerability mapping if it's done in a very general way. And the question is, can we do better? How do we have to highlight vulnerability that of course exists? How do we do that? Whether it's visually, whether it's conceptually, what is it we can actually say about vulnerability in the tropics and feel comfortable about it and make decisions based on people who are really vulnerable or sectors and enhance their adaptive capacity? So the challenges here is that we want to focus on social vulnerability, and we don't quite know yet how to best do that. Can we really take poverty as a proxy for adaptive capacity? Can we understand what poverty means? And what metrics we may want to use when we think about poverty or think about using poverty as a proxy. I have two maps in here, and we've used those in our chapter in the IPCC, Livelihoods and Poverty. So let me just explain, and that has to do with metrics of poverty. The most common poverty metrics is, of course, the International Poverty Line, World Bank, $1.25 a day. And so what you see here on the x-axis is populations per country that are beyond the poverty line as it is specified by the World Bank. And then we have an alternative measure of poverty called the Multidimensional Poverty Index that came out just 2010 by the UN that looks at other drivers of poverty, not just economic drivers. And I will show you an example in just a second. What we would want, of course, is that these dots that all show countries meet on the axis between these two measures. And of course they don't, right? If you're Niger, the country Niger, you may have 40% or maybe 45% of your population below the poverty line according to the World Bank standard. But if we use the multidimensional poverty index, it's almost 100%. That makes a difference, right? Also, these standards don't tell us anything about how far a population is from crossing the poverty threshold, right? How deep is poverty? And that's something which is expressed by these maps, which are called poverty gap maps. And you can see two examples, one for Malawi, one for Vietnam. The darker the color, the further away this particular district from crossing the international poverty line, right? If you're just that far away, maybe you cross it next year. If you're that far away, you're stuck in the poverty track for the next 3 decades. It makes a difference for vulnerability and adaptation. This is a quick example of how this multidimensional poverty index is constructed, and I think it's a really useful approach, but of course it's much harder to map. It uses individual or household data and looks at particular dimensions of poverty, and you have those highlighted here. The data for households allow us to construct little narratives, in this case about a woman from India, and in her case, all the light ones here is where she is below the expectation. She just does not have enough resources to be considered a flourishing household. In her particular case, she's not only multidimensionally poor, she's destitute. So how far away from the poverty threshold? That makes a difference for vulnerability. So let's use these more sophisticated data. Okay, how I'm doing in terms of time, my timekeeper? How much more? 10? Great. So let me show you a little bit of how we have conceptualized vulnerability in the IPCC in the 5th assessment report. Again, this is coming out of the SREX. And that is absolutely crucial for all of you who want to do vulnerability studies. Move away from exposure, sensitivity, adaptive capacity. And this is the way it works. We have a climate hazard, we have exposure, and we have vulnerability. They're separate, 3 separate ideas here. The potential occurrence of a physical event or trend that may cause loss of life, injury, or damage, that's a hazard. A physical event or a trend. Exposure is the presence of people or livelihoods in particular places that are exposed to that hazard. And here's the vulnerability definition as if we've seen it earlier. Propensity, predisposition to experience harm. At the center is risk. If these 3 overlap, people face risks. And that's what we want to understand. Where are risks highest? I've given 4 examples here of what goes into our current understanding of vulnerability. Limited ability to build adaptive capacity, for example, because of weak governance structures. Persistence of vulnerable conditions because of chronic poverty and institutionalized marginalization. High susceptibility to cumulative stressors. Those occur if we have constellations of conflict, areas, regions, constellations where people don't have access to healthcare services, where people are chronically malnourished. Every single climate trigger will push an individual or household closer over the edge or earlier. And the irreversibility of consequences if people just can't return to rain-fed agriculture, for example. So that allows us to understand impacts differently. In this case, impacts for women, additional duties that occur to certain women. And it allows us to understand risks, in this example, from heat waves or heat stress. Right? So that's what we're after. Can we distinguish what drives risks? And if we can do that, then we have a better chance of protecting people. I will get to this one in just a second. So the way we've tried to do that in our chapter is to conceptually convey what constitutes inequalities. And that's very different from mapping vulnerability for all the tropics. And we say, well, vulnerability, multidimensional vulnerability to start with, is driven by inequalities along the dimensions of gender, age, race, caste, ethnicity, ability, disability. And they intersect, they interact to produce a small number of privileged people who have high capacities and opportunities and very low multidimensional vulnerability, but they also produce tons of marginalized populations. And those are the ones we're concerned about, because they have very little capacities and opportunities and face vulnerabilities as high as nobody else. Okay? How do we map that? Here are two summaries from one from our chapter, one from the summary for policymakers. And we don't go over the details here, but you see the highlights. What is it we find? What is it we find consistently across geographic areas and across countries with various levels of income, poor countries and rich countries? We find that climate change and climate variability worsen existing poverty and exacerbate inequalities. And they're always linked to entrenched structural inequalities that shape these vulnerabilities. Right? The last one here I think is really important because it's in the summary for policymakers in Working Group 2 and was also part of the synthesis report. I was in Copenhagen when the synthesis report was approved, and that last sentence that came from our chapter originally also made it into the press release that came out in Copenhagen. People who are socially, economically, culturally, politically, institutionally, and otherwise marginalized are especially vulnerable to climate change and also to some adaptation and mitigation responses. We don't map that anymore. We can't. So our task is here to provide case studies that are compelling, where we can see these patterns emerge and reemerge so that we can have trends that are convincing to policymakers to act. And here are some examples of how we can visualize that. Again, conceptually. So we have livelihood conditions from vulnerable to resilient. We know in a household, in a community, these conditions change. They're not stable. They go up and down. What's important here is that at certain points in time, people encounter critical thresholds. Here, some people always benefit. They always can make the system work for themselves. Many people don't, and the large majority actually finds itself on a slippery slope downwards, and those are the people we're concerned about. These critical thresholds don't occur just because of a climate crisis. It's climatic stressors usually overlapping with economic stressors and environmental stresses. And when they converge, that's when these critical thresholds occur. And that's what we want to watch out for. I don't have time to go through the case studies, but there's one, maybe we can talk about it later, for the Bolivian Andes, an indigenous population in the highlands of Bolivia that shows exactly that pattern, except for the fact that we don't even have a middle group here. It's just that the large majority is losing out, and they don't have the political and the institutional voice to take on the same options than the richer folks can. And the same is true for coastal Bangladesh. Same thing. Where do policies intervene and when? How can we predict when people are going to go down that slippery slope? That's our job. And that's your job for students who are wanting to do that kind of work in the future. How can we better see how close we are to a critical threshold? We have seasonal vulnerability. Vulnerability doesn't stay the same throughout the year. This is an example from the Lake Victoria Basin, and it just shows you how, again, climate overlaps with, in this case, farming activity and diseases, and that these change from season to season, and there are certain areas, times, where people are facing hardship, and that's when they're really vulnerable. And again, the marginalized people in particular, and then they go through a phase of recovery. If these stressors happen over and over again, back to back, that recovery period will shrink. Human security, that's a graphic, conceptual again, out of the chapter, also new, on human security in the IPCC. We don't map security hotspots on the global map anymore. We can't. but we can show how dimensions of livelihoods intersect with cultural change, with conflict, and with migration and mobility in response to climate stressors and scales of insecurity. And we can understand interventions and policies and whether or not they improve the situation for people or whether or not they exacerbate that situation. That's what we're after. Let me show you two quick maps on observations, in this case, observed impacts. This was one map that was highly contested in the plenary of Working Group 2 in Yokohama in March. It shows observed impacts for three categories: physical systems, biological systems, and human and managed systems. You, of course, cannot see at all the continents behind, but you guys have seen many maps here. So Africa is here, South America is here, North America, Europe, Asia, Australia. Let's assume you are somebody who has worked on vulnerability studies, and let's say you're from Africa. Are you going to like this map or you're not going to like this map? So let's say Africa again is here. No, this is Antarctic, sorry. You work on vulnerability of people. Are you going to like this map or not? No? Somebody is courageous to say no. Why not? What is that? What's going on? Well, not a whole lot is going on here in Africa, it seems like, right? So, I mean, I can tell you off the top of my head, I know 100 studies on vulnerability in Africa, and only, 10 are shown? Why is that? Why is it that all the fantastic vulnerability studies don't make it on the map of the IPCC that looks at observed impacts? Because all these studies we do, and when we have detailed observations on vulnerability, we're not really doing what these guys mentioned in the morning session. We don't do detection and attribution. We don't really spend time going through all the climate data to observe whether or not climate change is really happening and whether or not the changes we see can be linked to climate change or not, detection and attribution. If we as vulnerability scholars don't do that, if we can't prove that climate change is happening, our great case study doesn't make it onto the map. Okay? Now, because this map was so contested and people felt their region was not represented, the solution then in the synthesis report was to rearrange these symbols and put them in nicely, symmetrical order so that folks who said, but we have studies from Mali, and Mali is not on the map, would no longer show up. It's a political compromise. Do I like this map? No, because we lose all geographic specificity, but it's a political compromise. Let me skip this. What can we say about future risks and impacts? We know that climate change will amplify existing risks and create new risks for natural and human systems. We also know that risks are unevenly distributed and are generally greater for disadvantaged people and communities in countries at all levels of development. We do know that. Can we map it? No. And you will see no vulnerability map in the AR5. But we can provide examples. And here are some for 3 sectors. I've underlined where the vulnerabilities are, the key vulnerabilities: poorer populations, urban populations who are unprotected, the marginalized, same pattern. We are not talking about vulnerabilities in the tropics being higher than in the subtropics. We are saying vulnerability can be high in any place in the US and in Europe if inequalities are high. And you know that the US is one of the countries with the highest inequality, and China is just around the corner. These are the places we have to watch out for. And by the way, the poorest people are no longer in the poorest countries. Most of the poor people are in middle-income countries, and we don't really spend a lot of attention on them. I will show you quickly how we can map, in a conceptual way, risks. And that's a complicated graphic, but this is how it looks like. I will zoom in for you. We have these same categories here: physical systems, biological systems, human systems. And we are interested in risks for the present, the near term, and the long term under 2-degree warming and the 4-degree warming. Low risk, high risk. We're worried about these bars that go out here. These bars here with the stripes show how risks can be reduced through adaptation. Consistently across sectors and regions, we see risks increase the further the warming increases. There's no doubt about that. What we're worried about are cases where the orange bars don't have any stripes, where there is no potential for adaptation. And I show you just 2 here. One in Africa for crop productivity and livelihood and food security, one for the bleaching of coral reefs, and one for heat-related stressors, almost no. There's almost no adaptation. What are you going to do if you are an outside laborer, if you have to work under heat stress, whether it's an urban area or a rural area? There's just no or very limited potential for adaptation. Let me skip these. I want to show you one more thing here. So where we are now is we want to understand vulnerability as a function of power. It's about understanding where in society political processes and markets deny certain people the rights to act for a better life. Maybe we can measure that, maybe we cannot, but what we should know is that people resist. People resist inequality and unequal structures. And that gets us to relational vulnerability. We have written a paper on that shows that we're not concerned about vulnerability in the tropics. We're concerned about the imbalance between harm and flourishing as a relational dysfunction. There's something wrong in societies if the gap between the rich and the poor increases and increases. And if we just focus on geographically specific impacts of climate change, this lens, this focus obscures what we call the unequal geographies of power. And this flourishing of some, the few, the elites, happens at the expense of those many, many, many who are disadvantaged. Simultaneously to our publication, there's another one that came out in Climate Change that looks at a case study in India that points out just that fact. Just that fact, how richer people take advantage through creating debt among poorer people, and how in that way the vulnerability is perpetuated. And it's not poor people's fault. It's because of the relationship between the richer people in the same location who take advantage of poorer populations. And I'm done here by concluding. Vulnerability is no longer a useful concept in regional contexts. So everybody who raised their hands by saying vulnerability is higher in the tropics than anywhere else, we cannot say that.
That's not what you asked.
What did I ask?
You asked if vulnerability was high in the tropics. High or low?
High or low? Yes.
It wasn't relative to other places.
Fair enough. And that's exactly what I wanted you to do. It's high, maybe, but is it higher than anywhere else? We can't say that. And I convinced all of you. I have achieved my mission. Great. As long as we stick to regional conclusions, we actually obscure the narratives that lay behind, right? We solidify these simplistic narratives rather than unpack them. What we need is a multidimensional, dynamic, relational understanding of vulnerabilities across all societies. We need to reduce vulnerabilities where they exist, there's no doubt, and it's a precondition for adaptation. However, we also realize that persistent inequalities, persistent poverty, chronic poverty and vulnerabilities create limits to adaptation, and that's the most dangerous and problematic ethical dilemma we have on the social science side of climate change. Thank you. Any questions? I know I spoke a little longer. It's so exciting.
You're right on time.
Fabulous.
And I'm going to leave you alone up here because you look perfectly capable of handling this content. And this is a fresh glass of water.
Lovely,
if you-
I'll take it. And I would really, really like to hear from the students. I know there are many students here. Some of you work on vulnerability. Be courageous. Come up here, let's embark on some debate. Wonderful. Thank you.
Hi, Professor Chackert. I'm Sarah Watson. I'm a policy and planning student at Blaustein. When it comes to creating these maps, how do you get the people who maybe are not necessarily, I guess, understanding of the nuances at a regional level or at the micro level? How do you get them to do maps that are, good?
Very often the people who use the maps are not those who have produced the maps, right? So it is our responsibility as producers of these maps to bring in all critical knowledge we have and to say where is it we can compromise, where is it we can simplify, and where is it where we refuse to compromise and simplify. And I think, part of the work I do, I work in Ghana quite a bit, I work in India, I work in Nepal, is to also work with researchers who train their own students, who are part of national vulnerability assessments, because it's a major, major, major source of money. If you look on Google, there are 10,000 vulnerability assessments. Do we need 10,000? Probably not. It's to say, how can we adopt a new way of understanding vulnerability and incorporate that into the way we visualize vulnerability? That's easier done than said, right? So what we see very often is that at a scholarly level, here, we are fully aware of this more critical understanding of vulnerability that sees vulnerabilities located in societies. 10 years ago, this is not what it was. But the practitioners often who work in NGOs, who work in disaster risk management units for governments, they are not on the same train we are. They're just getting the translations from the last IPCC report. And now here we come again and say, actually, what you just learned is all wrong. Do it like I tell you. This is an ethical dilemma, right? So I think what we have to do is to be constantly in touch with people who produce these maps and produce policy recommendations to say, can we think differently? What is the best way that your environmental minister can distribute the scarce funds for adaptation in an ethical way? So I think it's our job to maintain these collaborations and conversations so people who don't have the luxury to be at an event like this one, who don't have the luxury to work with the IPCC, have the state-of-the-art knowledge and can do a better job.
Thank you.
Nice question. Thank you. Another courageous one. Yes.
Hello, I'm from the Richard Stockton College. My name is Sarah, and you were showing a map of a vulnerability map which showed the Philippines as very dark red, and you said that you would not want to be the policymaker making plans for that area up in the north because, well, I didn't understand what would be the worst harm in maybe, making recommendations and over-preparing that area. What would be the worst that could happen as opposed to some other area in the Philippines?
That is a great question, and I need my tech assistants here to put me back to that map.
Sure. It was right in the beginning, right?
I lost the cursor.
Yeah, one there. And then it was
Scroll up.
Mm-hmm.
This one here.
This one, right? There you go.
Fantastic. Thank you. Great question. So let's assume you are a female farmer and you live here in this really dark red area. Maybe you are really vulnerable, but you also saw the profile I showed you earlier from the multidimensional poverty index. Maybe you're actually doing relatively well because you have had the luxury to have an education, you have a solid floor, you have access to water, and your children are well nourished. This would not show up here, right? So maybe there's no harm done if the environmental minister says, let's do an adaptation project here. But I'm not sure that this area really here is so much less vulnerable. Maybe the person who really, or the household or the community who really needs an adaptation project here, because according to the multidimensional poverty index, really those are the ones who don't have the assets to protect themselves, would fall through the cracks, because this area shows up as completely low priority. And I think that's the problem decision makers have when they just use a map like this. They say here, here, and here. What about here? Doesn't mean that you can't die here, and people do die.
Thank you.
Thanks, Sarah, for the question. Really nice. One more, two more, great.
Just a quick one. Couldn't you apply the same logic you're using to the Millennium Goals?
Let me repeat that. Couldn't I apply the same logic to the Millennium Development Goals? Which particular logic? That the certain nuances are not captured?
It's very hard to do. Basically, you're saying it's very hard to map out these things and determine programs and point people in the right direction.
That's why the Millennium Development Goals are revised now, and we're going to have the Sustainable Millennium Goals starting sometime next year. Remember, the Millennium Development Goals were supposed to be reached in 2015. Some will be reached, many will not, or certainly not in depth, maybe on average. But you know, averages are tricky. So we have a refined set coming up, again, Sustainable Development Goals. The 8 Millennium Development Goals, right now 17 Sustainable Development Goals are under discussion. I don't think it will be 17 at the end, but how they're going to narrow down the set they have right now to maybe 10 is not clear at this point. Stay tuned.
Hello, I'm Marion Thorpe, and I'm a student in cultural anthropology here at Rutgers. I have a comment and a question, and the first is that, and I don't think this is news to you, but to folks who do work in New Jersey, your comment that vulnerability maps on to larger societal inequalities is an observation that environmental justice folks in the US have been making for decades. So for folks who do work in New Jersey, I think your work is really relevant to that, and it speaks to the need to connect with what environmental justice advocates are doing within the US. My question is, the maps serve a utility for NGOs, right? For the funders who are looking for an easy way to pinpoint where they need to be sending their money. So it speaks to a need to educate, your work speaks to a need to educate funders to say, look, we need to be more nuanced about this. So I was wondering if you could speak to that, and if you could say if we're seeing a greater sophistication in how funders are understanding vulnerability in their work.
Great question, and I get a sign that says out of time. So I will just very briefly say, you're absolutely right. I mean, social and environmental justice groups understand the dilemma with maps very well. How NGOs and funders can be more nuanced. I think many people understand that vulnerability is inherent in societies, and many governments try to avoid that question, which is problematic, right? I mean, we know from Katrina and we know from Sandy that inequality is rampant in the US. When I talk to my undergraduate students, they have no idea because it is so well concealed. I think it's our job as educators, as people who have a voice, to speak out, and those of us who have a talent for graphic art, I'm dying to produce a map that shows blind spots. I don't know yet how to do it. Help me. I think I have to step down. We have more exciting work for you coming up. Thank you.